We have a very distinguished group of speakers. We're going to begin with Susan Miller-Havens, who is a psychologist in practice, and she is the Education Director of the American Adoption Congress. She's also been very active with an adoptee search and support organization, and she is one of the local very strong advocates for adoption and an educated and progressive view of adoptees and adoptees' rights and their psychology. We have Dr. Susan Clark, who is a PhD psychologist and who is the Director of Women's Mental Health at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, who has done research in what families intend to do about informing children of in vitro fertilization. Of donor insemination. And she has some results of her studies which may be a little bit surprising to us who've been active in the adoption field for so long. She's going to present her findings and some of her thoughts about her findings. She's also published on that topic in several places. And finally, we have Dr. George Annis, who is a JD, who is the Director of the Law, Medicine, and Ethics program at Boston University, the School of Medicine and the School of Public Health. And I think probably all of you have read Dr. Annis's writings in the general field of law, medicine, and ethics. He's been publishing, I know, in the New England Journal for many years. And you have a recent book out, Dr. Annis. What's the title? Standard of Care. Standard of Care. And I was, in fact, when it was suggested that we invite Dr. Annis, I was somewhat in awe. I said to people, and I said to Susan, you mean I should really call Dr. Annis? She said, sure, call him. Nice guy. So, here he is. Now, I have a few introductory comments. Which, I'm going to read these because I'm a lousy extempore speaker. So I'm just going to read these. The fact that there are common threads between adoption and reproductive technologies first impressed me when I was asked to testify in a Baby M case because of my experience with adoption. This suggested that there was already a body of knowledge within the adoption community concerning issues of truth, secrecy, and disclosure, and I was being looked to as a representative of that community to say something useful. I testified that it would be harmful to the child to grow up knowing that her birth mother had wanted her but had not been able to raise her. I also said there would probably be some adverse effects of knowing she was the result of a planned union between sperm and egg outside her mother's body. At that time, I had only a very small idea of the complexities involved. Mary Beth Whitehead, in spite of her obvious weaknesses, eventually won limited rights on appeal. Adoption and assisted reproduction have parallels, but can also be seen as being in competition. I recently wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine complaining that in a review article by 2 fertility specialists about ways to help infertile couples, the authors made no mention of adoption as a viable option. In writing about assisted reproduction in relation to adoption, Panner and Barron, in their book Lethal Secrets, emphasize the asymmetry that exists in the donor insemination family, in which the mother is a real parent of the child, while the father is not. They later describe psychological effects of that asymmetry. And I might add here that another asymmetry that recently struck me was that in donor insemination, the father does not have to adopt the baby. But in surrogacy, the mother of, the raising mother has to adopt the baby, which has some interesting implications in terms of anthropology, law, sociology, whatever. Within the professional adoption community, it has long been accepted that children have to be told about their adoptive status. The only live debate concerns the timing. Within the reproductive technologies community, however, there is no such unanimity, as we will hear from Dr. Clark. And the child's right to know is not generally assumed, nor are the ethical pros and cons of disclosure often approached directly, as they were 40 years ago in adoption. One concept that may unify the two areas is that of parent-child dialogue and affect tolerance in a parent. Some time ago, I began to see the timing issue in adoption as less related to chronology per se, or the readiness of the child, and more related to the state of mind of the parents. Were they secure enough in their relationship to each other and to the child to impart a piece of painful but necessary news, in the confidence that this would lead to unhappiness in the child that might be powerful but would be time limited? and could be worked through with the family's help? Could the parents tolerate the child's grief? Many times in adoptive families, particularly those who have adopted from abroad, when they are having serious problems with adolescent rebellion or emotional distancing, I find that parents have neglected the step of helping the child to mourn what was left behind. They do not even seem to think of this as an essential part of bringing up such a child. It is as though sadness were taboo in our culture. I would put forward the hypothesis that almost any piece of essential truth can be digested by a child if it is presented not as "this is about you," but as "this is about us, and we all have feelings about it." I'm delighted that we could have our three speakers. We'll start with Susan Miller-Havens.
It might not be appropriate to tell a joke, but it's one that I can't get out of my mind. It takes place in the year 2000, and the kid has a great relationship with his computer. He keeps challenging his computer, and his computer keeps saying, "I know everything, because after all, I'm God." As a result, the kid keeps asking him questions. He keeps coming up with the perfect answers. And finally, he says, "Well, if you're so smart, tell me where my father is." And the computer says, "Your father is rowing in Canada on Lake such and such." And he says, "No, that's not true. My father died 3 years ago." The computer returns by saying, "I told you, he's rowing on the lake in Canada." One of the things that I wanted to start by talking about, although it's sort of simplistic, but when I was thinking about it, was just, I started to think about who really keeps secrets, all kinds of secrets in our society. And it seemed to me that mostly people in authority or have a certain amount of power keep secrets, whether it's the government, physician, parents, sometimes social agencies. And there are lots of rationales for keeping secrets. And I guess the most common we hear about is, oh, well, someone would be better off if they didn't know, or it would be painful, or it would be Pandora's box. The decision that physicians used to make about whether or not they tell somebody that they had cancer, would it be better to keep that secret? Then there are a whole bunch of altruistic reasons, like the wonderful medical experiments that we've learned about recently, which are supposed to be for the good of us all, or Agent Orange, or all other sorts of governmental secrets. And then, of course, there are the secrets that are kept by people who are going to commit crimes. They're just trying to make sure no one finds out how they're going to pull it off. The ones that I felt were most appropriate to focus on in this discussion really has to do with the kinds of secrets that are kept because the person keeping the secret feels that the content is so shameful or is full of such worrisome detail that it's best to keep it to him or herself. One of the things that I'm interested in is the way Cicely Bach has looked at what I think is a mechanism of keeping a secret. And that is that people often don't think about the person who's keeping the secret. It's very difficult and time-consuming to keep a secret over a long period of time. And one of the things that happens to people is that they have a terrible conflict because on one hand, they feel very strongly that it's important to keep the secret. And on the other hand, there is a kind of urge to unburden oneself, to finally tell, or to break down the sort of suspiciousness that a good secret keeper has to have, always wondering if perhaps someone knows or someone will tell. And so I wanted to emphasize the fact that keeping secrets takes a toll on people for whatever reason that they're keeping them. And of course, I mean, you all know why adoption records were meant to be kept secret in terms of the rationales, or as protecting the triad, not wanting to embarrass anybody publicly about unplanned pregnancy, illegitimacy, etc. I think that this issue of disclosure is very pertinent for us because, you know, the truth of the matter is that telling someone about the fact of adoption is not something that is really what in the best of all worlds people would want. In the best of all worlds, I think most of us would admit that we would like to produce children who are biologically related to us. And I don't know of any kid who is dying to learn that he is not biologically related to you. So it's a very hard thing to make up your mind to tell, and to tell when and how you're going to do it. The thing that I was thinking about, and also Steve had mentioned, was, in the 40s and 50s, it was very tempting not to tell, because there were so many available babies for adoption, and the social workers did a magnificent job at matching kids in appearance and talents, and it was supposed to be as if they were biologically related. One of the things that I find very disturbing about the surrogacy and the reproductive alternative work is that I think it is once again extraordinarily tempting to do exactly what we did in the 40s and the 50s, and that is, if you have a mother who is the biological mother of this child, you have a 50-50% chance that that kid will look like the mother. And that's enough for a lot of people to say, we're not going to disclose. We're not going to tell. It will be our secret. Now the question is, why was it in the post-war years that social workers decided that they should tell the kids, there should be disclosure? I think that one of the reasons was because they did know, as we know, that there are lots of people involved in that adoption, and the secrets over a long period of time are hard to keep. But as I mentioned before, the people who are keeping the secrets, i.e., let's say maybe the physician and maybe the parents and maybe the agency or maybe not, are living with a lot of tension keeping that secret. And what we know now from adults who were told very late or not at all and discovered themselves that they were adopted, that in retrospect they will tell you what it was like living in that family. And you know what kids are like. Kids know when people are going to get divorced, they know when someone's sick, they know when someone's having an affair. They read it off the faces of their parents. They feel the tension, and many of them, it's so interesting, we'll talk about how they felt a terrible distance. They kept wanting it closer. And in fact, the person who keeps the secret has to stay distant to maintain that sort of tension. The other thing that we know about kids, now adults, who have been told late or not told at all, is that when they're told, the trust that they've developed between their parents is shattered. And in these situations, the sense of oneself in the world is bizarre. There's a whole reordering of what's going on here and what has happened. Recently, at the death of her mother, a 31-year-old woman was told about donor insemination between her parents by her father. And she says, "To my father, the fact that my mother was impregnated by another man was an ugly secret, as was his infertility. It was something to be ashamed of. As to the donor, I wondered why he could not connect the semen to the human being it would create." So this is her experience at 31, and this comes actually from some work that a colleague of ours did, and I don't know whether she was in treatment with him or she just had begun to relate this particular discovery. And Steve mentioned earlier that all this business about when you tell kids and how you tell them, we've made a lot of improvement on that. All the cognitive studies of Brzezinski about when kids can really understand that they're adopted, the whole idea that telling a child when they first ask, and then knowing that as they get older, by the time they enter elementary school, that it's only then when they can actually begin to think about what it all means and and what it all means is not only that your family loves you and took you in and cares about you, but also that you lost something really big and you're not too sure what it was that you lost. And of course, Brzezinski's recommendation, and I think it is most of ours in this field as well, is that you don't stop the conversation then, that you continue to talk about it as time goes on. That this idea of, well, kid knows that's it, now we're going to go ahead, doesn't work. So one of the questions that I'm always asking myself is how can a child really explain the relinquishment and the fact of his origins if the secret, and the secret meaning just the whole shindig, the circumstances, the whole story. It's not only that the secret's kept from him, but it's also very often and always in closed adoptions kept from the parents as well. So the adoptive parents really can't help in this situation either. And we also know that if a kid is able to stay with the painful affect, the idea that there is something missing, something lost, that one of the ways they cope is, some of them cope by just denying that they have any feeling about it at all, and others cope by developing little stories and fantasies about what might have happened. I became interested in studying these fantasies, now it's almost 15 years ago, I dare to say, but at the Adoption Connection, which is a search and support group in Peabody and has adoptive parents, birth parents, and adoptees in attendance. I was one of the support group leaders, and I started being struck very early by several things. And one was that the participants were not from a clinical group. And starting out then in my doctoral program, I felt that all I ever read about were sick adoptees and the pathology thereof and the discussion about, well, that's the only place we can find them is in the clinics. So it was a sort of a gift. The other thing is that this group, by and large, reported positive adoptive experiences. There were people coming to say that they hated their adoptive parents and couldn't wait to find a way out. I also noticed that there was a lot of talking about fantasies that had gone on for years. And it wasn't just at age 7 or 8, but a solid story that was now fixed in these individuals' minds. I will say that I'm convinced that gender does make a difference in studying these fantasies. And I chose to study the fantasies of the women in particular because I'm very interested in women's development and I wanted to frame it in a different way. I can later, if you want me to, tell you some about the fantasies that I know about from men, and they are different, and it's sort of fun to think about a day when I might be able to do that. The other thing I wanted to say was that I really was very impressed with the measures that were used in adoption research when I first started out on this task, because I didn't think it really reflected the adoptee's experience. And there were an awful lot of sort of putting a scale of 1 through 10 on whoever you could find and then saying that's their self-esteem or whatever. So one of the things I did over the years was to conduct pilot studies. And in the pilot studies, I was always asking something about a fantasy. And without getting into the details of it, what I ended up doing was developing a tool that was really informed by the adoptees themselves. And I threw out all that business of here's a negative fantasy and here's a positive fantasy, and decided to look at all the fantasies that people had that would reflect their ideas of why they were disconnected from their family of origin. And then on the other side, fantasies of what might connect them to that family. Now obviously it depends on what you're told, how you're going to spin your fantasy. So another part of the research was to do correlations between what people were told and what they found. The other thing I should just mention is that that in the last study there were 84 women, and ages from 19 to 63, which is a pretty nice range, and we had a 57% response rate. And I looked today, much to my horror, to see that I'd coded 2,000 responses. Anything to get out of graduate school. And of those 2,000, 1,300 were fantasy formation. So you can imagine they weren't told a lot. You know, it was very simple, typical, all closed adoptions. Your mother couldn't keep you; she loved you so much she gave you up. Your mother died. You know, the sort of the usual kind of stuff. And I thought I hate to read this, but I haven't memorized it, so I'll just read a couple of the findings. One was the fantasies that connect the adoptee to the birth mother through psychological, physical, and moral characteristics outnumbered those that reflect the fantasies of being disconnected from the birth mother 2 to 1. In other words, there really were an awful lot of detailed fantasies about what the birth mother was like. And at the same time, these women expressed very clearly their love for their adoptive mother. And that's a whole other thing. That's a whole other discussion about what the dual identity is then in a situation like that. Now, sometimes I think this is the most interesting finding, but depending on the age of adoption, the subjects represented in their fantasy images varying aspects of affect tolerance and grief resolution. Remember, we were before talking about, Brodzinski's talking about that at some point the realization comes that you've lost something. You're not too sure what it is that was lost. One of the things that interested me in this was that, you know, we're taught that, at least in Western civilization, that in order to grieve, you have to have two sets of circumstances. One is that you know the person's dead, and then we have some rituals to deal with that. And the other is to know that the person really does not love you, that the relationship is really over, that it's really final, and somehow or another you come to that after enough times, and then you get to grieve. The people who are involved in the MIA work and the missing in action will talk in a very similar way. All I need is the body, or for somebody to tell me exactly what happened, then maybe we can grieve, and I don't care if it's a foot or a leg, something, you know, and they go on and on about this. I think it's not dissimilar. Now, one of the things that I found so curious about these fantasies was that Winnicott said a very long time ago, and Bowlby did too, that the orphans, after the wars, waiting and waiting to see if they'd be claimed by their mothers, who were lost for all intents and purposes, did two things while they waited. They roamed around the nursery looking for her, and they fantasized. And when the news was brought, then they grieved. But in the meantime, it was like a terrible, sort of pathetic holding operation in these nurseries and orphanages. I think we can learn something from that, because I think that although adoptees are often very private and very loyal to their parents, I found the opportunity to actually read and hear and talk about the efforts to try to grieve through the fantasy material to really be very compelling. So, at any rate, the only time that I found that something was told to a person that did not precipitate some kind of fantasy formation were two situations. One was when the parents said, "That's it, your parents are dead, killed in a car accident." Many of those people, now that we in adoption work know them better, later on will question and say, "Great, let's go to the grave," when they're older. But at the time, it seems to just stop it. The other thing that seemed to stop it was when they were told, "There's no doubt about it, you are unwanted." So that the negative telling is so compelling these people reported anyway, that there wasn't any room for fantasy, or there wasn't any point in it, or so they just decided against it. I thought maybe I would just finish up by reading a couple of fantasies, and two situations. One is women who were really, I think, struggling to try to put their birth mother into perspective, and again, not being able to do any grieving, just churning it over and over. In spite of my internal anger at her giving me up, I suppose it was too threatening for me to think of her as a loser in the crowd, so to speak. Perhaps I build her up in my mind as someone famous and beautiful to compensate for how I really saw her deep inside. I wanted her to be what I felt I couldn't be because of the missing pieces. Not knowing the story of my conception and birth forced me to want to fantasize about my birth mother. I was looking for my connection, looking for the beginning. Now here's somebody who I felt there were a group of people who were trying to deny that they had lost anything, trying actually to deny that there was any disconnection. And here's someone who had no fantasies. And I should say that fantasy production varied from none, like this young woman, to 36 on just this one issue. I had no fantasy. As a child, I had great imagination, and I did fantasize, but never about my birth mother. The main reason for this, I believe, is that being adopted was so painful to me that I preferred not to think about it at all. Another woman says, I think that I would have found any negative fantasy of her intolerable. And then the last one, sometimes they'll develop a story over time. It gets a little more complicated. Since I was not adopted until I was 10 months old, I used to think that maybe my birth mom kept me sort of on the lam, living in different parts of the country, trying to figure out a way to earn a living. The reason I was in the home for so long was that she was away on business. The courts decided this took some of the responsibility off my birth mother, since I fantasized that she was not directly responsible for my relinquishment. Now this is a young woman who was told nothing about what the actual circumstances were, but she worked backwards, thinking she was adopted so late. She had to fill in those pieces. And I guess the last one that I want to read has to do with a person who feels totally connected to her birth mother, and again someone who reported that she loved her adoptive mother very deeply. She was very much life to me. I fantasized that she looked like me. She was very musical, passionate, intelligent, educated, religious, and a victim. She's very sad, and I'm very sad. And I fantasize that she's me. She's my soulmate. She's me, and that I have lost. She's the presence beneath this huge sense of loss I've always lived with. She's home, a place of beginning and return, the wholeness that I've never been able to acquire. She's my mother in a connection, in a longing and in a belonging that I've never had. She's the child in me, and she's my spirit. I hope she's come to terms with this loss and pray that she's happy, but I think we are both very sad. So, summing it all up, I think adoption has taught us so much. I mean, I know it's taught us so much about so many things. And it increases, because it's not only what we know about the psychological impact of adoption and how you best deal with one another, but the genetic situation is just galloping along, and to be an adult or a child with no access to what is transpiring in a biological family as time goes by and people get sick and somebody gets diabetes, at the least, just on the small, and George will probably address the medical ethical issue, but at the least, of not being informed of what might be coming ahead as you grow older is pretty tough. I do find a lot of things very frightening, and the thing that frightens me the most at the moment is the amount of money that is around in arrangements to both adopt privately, to involve surrogacy and the reproductive alternatives. You really can buy just about anything you want. And I think that if I could put all of those things into one hamper, I feel that they're disregarding what we've learned, and there are an awful lot of us who've learned a lot over time, since the 40s at least. The trouble is that there's no control over the deals that adults make. And there's no control locally, there's no control in terms of what goes on nationally. I think sometimes when I hear the simplest thing about the reluctance of donor inseminator fathers to reveal this fact, to disclose this fact, it seems like it's 50 years ago. And it's someone saying it's hard for me to face the fact that I'm infertile. And I don't like it that some other person's sperm is going to be creating my child. And I don't like it. And I've got a doctor, and I've got a lawyer, and I got the sperm in Yugoslavia. And I'm not telling anybody, because it cost me $50,000. Why should I? And there's no one that I know of who is going to say that they have to do that. And if they do, they'll go someplace else. They'll go to somebody else's clinic. And I think if anything, it would be wonderful for us to think about how we can get to those sorts of problems and try to affect them. And you all have the answers to that. I just have the complaints. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Susan, you always seem to manage to both convey a very deep knowledge of the subject and also connect emotionally with the audience. That's why I had a question in my mind about when children were told that unequivocally they were unwanted. It raised a question in my mind about whether that would not lead to the formation of a negative identity, but I'll ask you that later.
Yeah, just no fantasies.
Okay. Incidentally, we have at least two other people that are here today that would have been on the panel if we had not decided that we had to keep it down to a certain number. So we're looking forward very much to a lively discussion afterwards. Next is Dr. Susan Clark from the Brigham and Women's Hospital.
Hello there. It's nice to see all of you today. Susan, I began doing this work because I was scared too. And I want to just preface this a little bit by how I got into this kind of research on the psychological aspects of the reproductive technologies. About 5 years ago at University of Connecticut Medical School, I was hired as a staff psychologist for obstetrics and gynecology. And in that role, I was the gatekeeper for who was going to get IVF, one of the gatekeepers, and who was going to get donor insemination. Were they psychologically okay? And one of the questions that we got all the time was, what should I do? Should we tell or should we not tell? And I just would throw up my hands and I would say, I don't know. You know, I know what the experience in adoption has been. We can't say that the two are identical, but we can say that there's a lot of similarities and certainly a lot to learn from that paradigm. The other part of this that's really frightening in a way is the very strong bias towards secrecy that has been traditionally linked to donor insemination. The first case of donor insemination was reported in 1909. Obviously, at that time, they were using fresh semen samples, and the traditional practice was the physician would have the medical student in the other room producing the sample and would inseminate the woman in the next office. And no records were kept. No one talked about it. Certainly no one acknowledged male infertility and those issues that were happening for the husband, and the wife really was bound into the secrecy of the couple. And that was a very, very strong bias in all of this clinical work. And in fact, there were a couple of studies that I found in the 50s that did study patient satisfaction for donor insemination couples, and basically what they looked at was, they said, did you think that this was a better solution for you than adoption? That was the question they asked. They were not concerned about how the family was developing. They weren't concerned about how the couple felt and issues of disclosure or secrecy. They said, how does this compare to what you know about adoption? In the last 15 years or so, we have had a very lively discussion in the organization that I belong to, the American Fertility Society, about what we as mental health professionals should do as we work with infertile couples about this question. What should we do? A place that we thought we would begin is to find out what couples are actually doing. And that's where the research began. And I want to review some of that with you, just to get you up to speed in terms of what has been done, and then talk a little bit about our own work in this area. In 1980, Manuel and his colleagues in France interviewed 72 couples and asked about whether the family planned to tell the child. And what they found was about 61% said no, they would not. 40% said that they would eventually tell. Reasons that they commonly gave for not telling were that the child would belong more to the couple if they didn't tell, more of a feeling of ownership if the couple didn't know. Second reason was a fear of social stigma for the child, and third was a fear of a negative reaction from the child to the psychosocial father, and the last reason was to protect the psychosocial father's self-esteem, and that those 4 reasons were compelling enough to the couple to not tell. Interestingly, with this study, there is not follow-up. This was just their intention about what they planned to do. We don't know if that's what they actually did. And what we'll see in some later studies, or a later study, is that there tends to be a trend towards more privacy or more secrecy instead of towards more openness. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Clayton and Kovacs did a study in Australia in 1985. And they found that about 70% of their couples planned to not tell, 14% planned to tell, and 18% didn't know what they were going to do. Now, this was 1 to 2 years after they had a child. So this is different than Manuel's study, because with Manuel's study, it was all just a concept in the abstract. Rowland also did a survey of Australian couples and found that 56% planned not to tell, 9% planned to tell, and 35% were undecided. And again, the most common reasons given for not telling were to protect the man's self-esteem, fear of a social stigma that would be attached to the child, and that the couple wanted to feel more ownership of the child. Now, related to this question of whether they're going to tell the child, and this is a point that Rowland brought out that was very important, is are they telling other people? And what Rowland found was that the majority of people do tell other people, but ironically are not planning to tell the child. And this puts them in a real bind. And I think what happens clinically as we work with these couples, it is such a very difficult decision for a lot of reasons. It's dealing with the infertility, it's dealing with what they perceive as a social stigma, because donor insemination is, I think, the second least approved of the reproductive technologies, second only to surrogacy. I mean, this is not something that communities embrace and say how great this is. And couples are aware of that. They're not doing this in a social vacuum. And I think they're really saying, it's such a difficult decision, I have to process it, I have to talk about it. But then when it comes to the child, they're not sure what they're going to do. And it's so difficult to share this important information that they think, well, I'll try to keep it a secret. Not really thinking about, if a dozen people know a secret, it's not really going to stay a secret over the course of a person's life. So these issues began to be talked about clinically in the early 80s. 3 American studies have focused on couples' attitudes and behaviors about privacy and disclosure. Amuzu has the largest study of about 400 donor-recipient couples. And this was largely a study looking at the medical status of the offspring. She wanted to know if there's a greater incidence of congenital abnormalities or medical conditions. But she did kind of incidentally say, well, what are you going to do about telling the child? And what she found was that about 72% had told their obstetrician, 50% had told at least one other family member, but again, the majority, over 60%, said that they weren't going to tell the child. So the next study was a study that we did. By this time, I was saying, I've got to do this. I've got to look and see what our group of couples are doing, because I thought it would be helpful for us to get a sense of how to counsel couples. And we did a retrospective study. We went back in our files for the 7 years, and we sent a survey to couples and asked them what they were going to do. And I didn't expect this, but I got very, very angry letters back. How dare you put this in writing and send it through the U.S. Postal Service? So we got that from a minority of couples, but it was very, very significant. We hadn't even thought about it, but this was a very powerful emotional reaction. Of the responses that we did get, what we found was about 60% had told at least one other person. The most common people to be told were the mother of the woman, the father, the woman's best friend, referring physician, close friend, sister, brother, and last, the therapist, which I always remember. The couple was then asked, we asked them, if you had it to do over again, what would you do? 87% of them said if they had it to do over again, they would tell no one. And this is 1 to 7 years after they'd had a child. Of the subjects who had told somebody else, 81% said that they would tell no one if they had to do it over again. So we went back and we scratched our heads and we said, what is happening here? Because there's a real dichotomy in the clinical community of the mental health professionals. Many of us have a bias towards openness, many of us have a bias towards secrecy, many of us are in between kind of wringing our hands going, oh my gosh, we don't know what to counsel these couples to do. And this was really compelling information for us to have. We asked the couples then, are you going to tell the child? And 86% said they weren't. 14% said they didn't know. We didn't get anybody who said equivocally that they weren't going to tell.
Anybody?
Nobody.
How large was the sample?
It was small, it was about 40 couples. The most common reasons for not telling, and this is very interesting, is that it would complicate the child's life unnecessarily. Second was that it would complicate the father-child relationship. And the most interesting to me is that they weren't going to tell the child because the husband could be the biological father because they had intercourse after insemination. So this we said, what's going on? About 44% of couples had intercourse after insemination.
That sometimes is suggested by the clinic.
Yes, it is.
So there's no way of
A
knowing.
lot, not
This is
any,
within 7 years, though.
right.
I'm talking about now, it is still.
Some people still suggest that.
Yeah.
And some husbands, well, some couples, I think this is obviously a joint decision, some couples feel that it gives them a connection on the day of potential conception of the child. I spoke with a colleague of mine, he said it's the fire hydrant theory, they need to reclaim their turf. I mean, I don't mean to be flip about it, these are just different ways that people were conceptualizing this finding.
Conceptualizing?
We then went on to say, okay, that was our retrospective study. We would like to follow these couples over a long period of time, get them from before treatment, and see what they do as time goes on. And what we also wanted to find out is what single women and lesbian couples did with this same process, because we thought there's much information to be gathered from these groups of people. So we took all couples who were coming into the program and invited them to be in the study. We tended to use measures that said, please answer on a scale of 1 to 10. You got self-esteem, marital adjustment, general psychiatric symptomatology, and then we asked them a variety of questions about their attitudes and beliefs about disclosure. And this study continues. We're in the 4th year of follow-up with these couples, and so I can talk just in terms of preliminary results the further along in time that we go. Among the heterosexual couples before treatment, 63% plan not to tell, 25% plan to tell. So there's been a shift already towards more disclosure since the time we did the retrospective study. And 11% were undecided. 100% of single women and 100% of lesbian couples will be talking to other people and will be telling the child about how the child was conceived. This is a very obvious finding because the issue of male infertility is not there to deal with. And for most of these couples, the community that they're in is much more supportive of the choice that they've made in terms of how they're going to form their family.
Is that true?
In terms of the communities that they,
Mhm.
from what they tell us,
Sorry.
it's really interesting now. Every year I call the couples and I talk to the husband and the wife, and you get some very, very interesting information over the phone. Most of the single women are really overwhelmed by the amount of work it is. They're not into this disclosure secrecy thing. They're like, yeah. I'll deal with that later. I've got to find good daycare. The lesbian couples seem to me to have a great situation. They have a very supportive community. They have a partner there to help them with the transition to parenting. And from all we can tell, do really well. In a lot of ways have much less anxiety than the heterosexual couples, because there's the pressure of the decision for the heterosexual couples.
But is it true that the single women have more supportive community than
I
the
haven't looked at that data.
heterosexual?
I haven't looked at that
community?
data. I don't know. I don't know.
All right. That was the one, I mean, I could
Oh.
see the lesbian couples might,
Right.
but I
But
wasn't sure about the
Single women have to have an explanation, though, and there's
Right.
it's not, they've got to say
Absolutely.
something to the
Absolutely.
child, so.
Right,
Right.
and I would guess that for many of them, it's a far better explanation to say I went to a sperm bank and got inseminated than I went to a bar and picked up a guy and slept with him. I mean, it's a rank ordering of how good the solution is, possibly. At 5 months of pregnancy, among the heterosexual couples, 71% said they weren't going to tell. And it didn't change at all for the other two groups. 1 year post-delivery, on the data that's in, it's now up to 80% who said that they're not going to tell. So we tend to see a trend. I don't know if it's statistically significant. Just at first glance, it looks like there's a tendency towards privacy. What is going to be very interesting to see is once this child is interactive and talking, and just as my own experience as a new parent, I think it's very different how you have a relationship with an infant if it's not verbal, versus how you deal with the child who's growing and developing. So I think this will be very interesting to see. In summary, based on the aforementioned studies, we can say the majority of couples plan not to tell. And now what are we going to do with this information clinically? And this is now the focus of a group that I work with, again, in the American Fertility Society. How are we going to come up with policies or recommendations about what we do when we're working with these couples? We know from the psychotherapy outcome literature, or psychotherapy literature in terms of how people change and what prompts them to change, you can't go in and say you have to do this because you're met with resistance. And people aren't going to do that most likely unless they're ready to do it. But we certainly feel we have to point out that we think there's a lot of risk in not telling. So it comes to a question of how can we intervene? How can we talk about both scenarios, really bring to their attention what we see as many pitfalls that are ahead for them if they continue to choose to keep this a secret. The next area that we also want to branch out into is what is this doing to the family and what is this doing to the child? And now I want to just tell you this is not database, these things that I'm about to say, this is all my opinion after working with the reproductive technologies. We have really put ourselves in a really rough situation of creating a generation of children that we don't have a language to describe their origins. We have gestational carriers, we have egg donors, we have psychosocial mothers, psychosocial fathers, sperm donors, and we don't have any rules or social rituals to deal with any of this. And I think we're going to have a generation of children, at least who have been created this way, who are really not going to know what to do with their identity. They're going to have real struggles with how to come to grips with third-party, fourth-party, and fifth-party reproduction. In addition, we have a group of parents also, as there's more choice and more options available for where you get your sperm and what you know about your donor. You can literally go into a computer bank, you can pick blue eyes, interest in music, IQ above 120 from Germany, who rides horses. And with that ability to choose, I think the couples come away with that feeling like there's going to be this ideal child at the end of this process. And when a child is a child and not ideal, because no child is, they're not going to know what to do. And I think it's going to be a very, very difficult transition to parenting and a very difficult relationship to negotiate. So, at this point, I think I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much.
Sue, I'd like to ask just
Yeah.
3, in terms of study questions,
Mhm.
for clarification. Of those people who said that they would now not tell anyone, would that
Mhm.
also include the family physician who's treating the child? I mean,
Yes.
did you break that down in that manner? Do you know whether that included that? The-
Yeah, we did, and they would prefer that no one know, even the
Okay.
pediatrician, because what they would like ideally is like they would like to, what they tell us is that they would like to have the donor's medical information and they could present it to the pediatrician as if it's the family medical information.
Okay.
That's
so
the wish.
Okay, that was one of the things. The second thing was, have you done any follow-up on individuals who have said that they were going to tell to find out what body of information we have around who have told their child successfully, meaning if we're going to encourage people to do it, we need to
Right.
say, these are families who've done it and this has been the outcome, because I don't think you're going to buck the secrecy resistance unless we've got some material to give
Some
these
good-
folks.
Right.
And the third thing is, have you incorporated into the model any look at, particularly, because this is the place where I hear about it the most, in the lesbian community, identified donors?
What's the question about identified donors?
Because what's happening for the women that you're working with,
Yes.
who come in as single lesbian or
Mhm.
paired lesbian
Right.
women for insemination,
Mhm.
they are selecting to not have an identified
Right.
donor, but there's a whole community and
That
there's
are
a
doing
movement, like
directed
Chain of
donors,
Life,
right.
that are looking at identified donors. And I'm just interesting to know, had you thought about possibly following up to see if there were some differences?
We thought about that. The rules about this are very, very interesting. Our program wouldn't do directed donor for lesbian couples. Now, and this is a very interesting question. Again, if you look at gender differences with this, they do directed donor for egg donation when it's sister to sister or friend to friend. They don't do directed donor when it's semen, brother to brother, friend to friend.
Why?
What?
It's just the way it is. Some of that has changed. At the Brigham, they have just said, we will allow, we will allow brother to brother or friend to friend semen donation because they broke that barrier with egg donation. The other issue with all the disclosure and secrecy, this is only with donor insemination. Egg donation, it's a whole different ballgame. Women tell, and they plan it. They plan it ahead of time. They say, Aunt Sally is your egg donor. This is what we're going to tell. She's a special aunt. She has a special relationship to you. They deal with it in a much different way. And I think obviously that is because of the traditional connection between male sexuality and male fertility. And sexual self-esteem is very tied to their fertility. Whereas for women, I think there's a greater psychological distance between their fertility and their sexuality. And so the female problem with fertility maybe is not as damaging to their sense of sexuality. So it's easier for them to talk about and deal with.
Thank you. In terms of digesting the information, I needed to get some clarifying
Yeah, sure.
pieces.
Could we get some impression about the size of that population? What is the birth incidence of alternate pregnancy production? In other words, the Brigham has 11,000 births a year.
Yeah.
What, are we talking 2-digit numbers? Are we talking 3-digit numbers?
10% of all American couples of the reproductive age are infertile. 20% of that is male infertility. About 20% is, I'm trying to think, I may be setting the wrong numbers here. I believe it's about 20% is male infertility. There's also, I know there's about,
15 to 20,000 infants per year.
it's 40, 40, and 20.
Or 40, 40.
40,
whatever
40,
adds
20.
up, 20,
40
right?
is male, 40 is female, and 20 is either unknown or both.
But this figure,
Figure I'm giving you is from Bernstein, 1993. 15 to 20,000 infants per year are born through DI, donor insemination.
See, my last estimate's about 30,000
And
per
well,
year.
these are the ones that we know about.
Right.
When you think of the hundreds of
Turkey-based
thousands
pregnancies
of,
are all over.
not only that, but the physicians who are doing it.
Mhm.
And the home turkey baster, but the docs who are doing it, who are not keeping any records. I would double this, maybe triple it, Alan.
This is a course I took.
In the interest of having a rich discussion after all the presenters, perhaps we could stop the comments and questions now. Now, I would like a consensus. Should we take a 5-minute break now or after Dr. Annis? Looks like we can wait a few minutes. Okay. Dr. George Annis.
Insemination was adultery, but that if the woman had sex with her husband after she was inseminated, she had forfeited the right to get divorced because of adultery. So that was what that was all about. It was just silly. Actually, when I came back in '76 for the clinic to do an in-service program, it turned out the nurses were telling the couples after they were inseminated to go home and have sex. And when they asked why, they would say, "It's the law." So there's a number of issues here. I found this discussion fascinating. The question of whether you tell is one, and we can talk about that. The next question is what you tell, and what can you tell? My interest over the years has been primarily in record keeping. What records should physicians be required to keep? And it's absolutely true, as both speakers have said, the history of this is physicians not keeping any records. Or if they keep records, destroying them as soon as the child is born. Some of them used to keep records until the child was born and then destroyed them. It was also very common for the physician to recommend that the couple not even tell the obstetrician, get a different person to deliver the child so that the obstetrician wouldn't have to lie on the birth certificate, but they put down the husband's name as the father, because as far as the obstetrician knew, it was the father. And obviously they never told the pediatrician, that's absolutely right, let alone anyone else. In a law review article written like 20 years ago, the policy of not telling was actually called the policy of secrecy. And I just assumed that was the right policy, and the author talked about how we can keep this policy and make sure that no one ever finds out. So that certainly has been the history of this. Although now there's great discussion in the field as to whether this is the right policy, and if not, what can be done about it. I don't have any data or any studies, but there is a case that actually did give some insight similar to the ones we've heard. The case of Cecil Jacobson, that some of you may know about, who was a physician in Virginia. Originally at George Washington University, they'd like to forget about him, but then moved to Virginia and opened up a private practice. And for at least 15 years, had a policy of using his own sperm to inseminate women. Who knows how many children he had? But the U.S. attorney was able to document 70, and it's probably closer to 300 or 400 children living in the Northern Virginia area that are children of Cecil Jacobson. When the U.S. attorney decided to prosecute Cecil Jacobson, he had a very interesting question. He had a lot of them, and he was a former student of mine, so he came to talk to me about some of these. Well, one was, how do you tell the couples that Cecil Jacobson was the father of their child? None of them knew. A couple of them suspected, as it turned out. But how do you tell them? Because they have a right not to know, in other words. They didn't want to know who the father was. It was all anonymous. Most of them thought that they had given Dr. Jacobson some requirements for the father. He'd always said, yes, he'd do that. They were, certain height, weight, background, whatever. But they were all him, of course. So what was ultimately decided was to hire some therapists and to interview the couples and to kind of, if they come in. I mean, you talked about sending them something in the mail. Well, they had exactly the same reaction. They initially sent some letters in the mail. The couples were horrified. They didn't want this. They didn't, what if my daughter opens it? What if my son opens it? And so they wound up sending U.S. Marshals Talk to them, I don't know if they like that better.
That keeps us private, that's for sure.
And talk to them, and say that the U.S. Attorney would like to speak to them. And they had a long conversation, and what they explained to me is that after a while, you would kind of get the idea of what was coming. You could leave at any time. If you decided you didn't want to know this, you didn't want to hear about it. And about half the couples did. About half the couples did. When it got all through, then if they stayed, they told them what they suspected, and then asked if they could take blood samples from their kids to compare with Jacob and see if he was the father. And most of them actually agreed to that. And then the group that agreed to that, actually majority then agreed to testify as well. Although in disguise, they all testified in disguise with wigs and hats. So it was quite interesting. When the case is over, then the question, which we'll talk about later on, is what do you do now? Now that you know there's 300 kids from Cecil Jacobson living in Northern Virginia, you set up a registry? Which is actually what we recommend. You set up a registry. Just keep the record somewhere. Not tell anybody, but if the kids want to know when they're 18, they can go to the registry and find out. And everybody in Northern Virginia knows about this case.
Well, marrying your half sister.
Yes, absolutely. No, they're all happy. And the other one, it's an interesting question too, whether they have a right to know about their half-sibs and whether they have some interest in knowing about the giant family now. Whether they have some interest in knowing about this, not just because of marrying and dating, but just because they are their half-siblings and they're, whether they should know about them. But the Jacobson case shows why it's not just probably a good idea to keep records, and you couldn't do something like that. Of course, he got a lie on the records too, I guess you could say. But in any event, he didn't keep any records either, of course.
What was illegal about that?
You want to know what he was prosecuted for? He was prosecuted for mail fraud. For sending bills for his own sperm instead of other people's sperm in the mail.
I mean, we all know what's wrong, but.
No, that's what makes it illegal.
Is there a law in the
That's
books
right.
that
No,
says
he
it's
was
wrong?
actually convicted of mail fraud. And it's a federal crime, that's why he was tried in federal court. He's in jail now, he's been in jail for a long time, actually. The other thing he did, by the way, was tell women they were pregnant or not pregnant. And injecting them with hormones to produce a false pregnancy, and he'd do ultrasound and say, some of you may have seen this movie, it was actually a movie, which was pretty accurate actually on television a couple of weeks ago. And that was probably even worse. I mean, you can argue which is worse, but it was just devastating to the people who really, really wanted to have a child. He kept saying, then he would say, no, your child has been absorbed. And the women, they did something wrong, they killed their children. And it was just horrible. Anyway, probably a modern trend is to use a donor form similar to ones used in the California sperm bank. When they get their donors, they give their donors a choice that either they can be completely anonymous and confidential, or that their records will be kept and the information about them, identifiable information about them, will be released to the offspring after the offspring is at least 18 years of age and requests the information in writing. All right? And that the donor has a choice. In Canada, which is the latest group to look at the ethics and make recommendations about this. This is a report that came out 6 weeks ago. They considered what they call this dual system, and they argued, a very interesting argument, that this would create two classes of DI children. Those who had access to named information about their genetic father and those who did not. And they said, quote, this would be intrinsically unfair, since if it's beneficial for one group, it must be for the other one as well. And they argued that whatever system is chosen, we should treat all DI children equally. And ultimately, this Canadian group recommended that all children have access to medical information about their fathers, but not to identifiable personal information, which they said is name, address, and place of birth. So that's a big issue. That probably is the major issue, I think, right now about what you tell. It's one thing to say you're a product of artificial insemination. Another thing, it's a similar enough to say, well, that means, your medical history of your social father is not your medical history, so here's the medical history of your genetic father. And I think there's pretty wide agreement on that one way or the other. One thing that's come out of the Genome Project is a suggestion in adoption as well as artificial or assisted reproduction, is that the couple get a blood sample, which you might call it DNA sample of the genetic parent to keep with the kid's medical record, so that if genetics become an issue, you can do that testing easily enough. But the harder question is, should records be kept that the kid may have access to when they're 18 about the actual identity of the father? And so far, that's just something we can discuss. Now, this is not just an issue, obviously, with artificial insemination by donors, but I'm suggesting it's an issue with surrogate motherhood, as of course it is, when the although harder to keep secret there, but I guess it's not impossible to keep secret. But it's also an issue with ovum donation, with egg donation, very similar issue, although what we've just heard is true, it's maybe not that big an issue. Maybe women don't care as much as men, that's certainly may be true. But one of the issues, the bigger issue probably, I think it is a bigger issue, with women is the identity of the mother for legal purposes. Historically, and it's still true in every state except California, the woman who gives birth to the child is the child's legal mother for all purposes. All right. In California, that's not true. California Supreme Court said that it's up to the couple who the mother is. Very weird ruling, which involved a strange case, actually, in a sense. It was a couple, an Asian woman, and it actually becomes a little bit relevant what ethnic backgrounds there were. A white man who hired a black woman to carry their embryo. And I personally think there's no way the judge was going to say this black woman was the mother of this white child. But the judge didn't put it that way. The judge said that the parents, the legal parents are the intended parents. Parents who are intended, actually following a theory purported by my friend and colleague John Robertson, who believes basically that parents should be able to decide whatever they want to decide about who's the mother, who's the father, and who gets to raise the child. And that's basically American law right now, by the way. That's pretty much the way it is. And American practice is based more on market values and on just the wishes of people who can pay for these services than on anything else. And the court basically agreed with that. That's obviously a little strange because we don't think of that anyplace else in real life. Many men have no intention of fathering a child when they have intercourse with a woman, especially when they're both single. But that doesn't matter. We still know who the child was, the father was, and we still, at least now, are starting to pursue them for child support, etc. Intentions have never mattered in human reproduction. They're starting to seem to matter, at least to some people, in these new reproductive technologies. So who does the law presume the mother is very, very, very important. I mean, with artificial insemination, the reason you don't have to tell anybody is the law presumes that any child born during the marriage is a product of the marriage, period. All right. In some states, it's an irrebuttable presumption. California being one of those. That's it. If the child is born during the marriage, it's a child of marriage, period. That's for the benefit of the child. You know, obviously, and most laws have been for the benefit of the child. In assisted reproduction, new reproductive technologies, most policies are for the benefit of the couple. They have nothing to do with the child. They just assume that the child's always better off existing than not existing. The child wouldn't exist if it wasn't for new reproductive technologies. Therefore, let's not worry about the child, let's worry about the parents. And that's not a very persuasive argument for many people, but it wins if you think you know, that if you're in this business, it's hard, and you would like that argument because you can do what you want. The final area, and then I'll quit, is embryo donation. Embryo donation where neither the mother or the father has a genetic link. In surrogate motherhood, obviously, the father has a genetic link to the child. In ovum donation, the father has a genetic link to the child. And in artificial insemination, the mother has a genetic link to the child. In embryo donation, neither parent has a genetic link to the child. So has sometimes been called prenatal adoption. Now, that's one question. Do you treat it like prenatal adoption? And then you tell the kid that about that, or it's very easy not to tell the kid anything about this, or you just pretend it's your genetic kid as well. And there's no policies in that. Believe me, not at all. And then we don't have this yet, but with the cloning debate and the embryo splitting debate, we could have a situation where your twin brother or sister is in another family. You may not even know about him or her. And good question, that's the question, whether you have a right to know about your twin brother, your twin sister, or your sibling, which will really be your sibling this time, would be totally your genetic brother or sister, but raised in another family. Whether that matters to anyone. There's some small probability you might get married, in which case you probably should know about it. But other than that, is there a reason to know about that or not? Is a question that I think is worth talking about a little bit. And then finally, the generic issue of the Human Genome Project and genetics, and whether we're getting to a point where all of us are going to get all our genes screened, and whether in the future, very soon future, it's going to be totally impossible to keep any of this stuff secret, because we're all going to have a gene screen run on ourselves and be able to, and our parents, there's no way our parents can keep their genetic material away from us as long as we get their hair samples, right? So whether any of this is going to matter, whether we're going to have to start saying not if we tell, but how we tell, because kids are going to know, at least know that they're, that the parents were not their genetic parents. They're not going to know who their genetic parents are unless we have this, which some people have proposed, this U.S. human gene or DNA database, where anybody can go in with a DNA sample and find out who it matches. But even then, you couldn't figure out who your parents were, unless you had some elaborate linkage system. So. But you could figure out they weren't your parents. You could figure out who was not your parent. And I think in the future that's probably going to be very easy to do and much harder to keep the secret now in the future than it is now. All right, but that's enough to suggest some things we can talk about.
Thank you very much. Do people want to take a 5-minute break?
My friend who called me, ironically, the other day and said, I've got a terrible problem. I've got a friend who has a 10-year-old son. He's a product of DI. They never told him. My friend says he has these extraordinary bright blue eyes, and he's running around the house saying, I don't see them anywhere. Where are they? And she is hysterical. What should I tell her to do? Now we have a kid who's 10. And one of the things that disturbs me is that there's a lot of DI literature that says there is no comparison between adoption and DI. Concretely, in terms of who's delivering the baby, there isn't. But I'm hoping that as professionals we can figure out some way to teach other professionals, people in social work schools. I mean, there shouldn't be any question as to whether there should be disclosure. Should there? I mean, or have I just totally lost my mind?
There's still a question among mental health professionals in infertility because there's a long tradition of privacy. They even go so far as to make a differential between secrecy, which implies privacy with shame, privacy, a choice not to tell, and disclosure. So they use those three terms. Now, I will just share with you an experience I had recently. In our latest paper we submitted to Fertility and Sterility, which is a journal that lots of this stuff comes out in, one of the editors, we had a pretty lengthy discussion section making a recommendation that you must talk about both options with your couples. You have to talk about the pros and cons of privacy and the pros and cons of disclosure. And I got back from the editors, this discussion section is too long. I really don't understand why you're talking about these issues. This is the mentality in this area, and that's what you're up against. I agree with you in principle. And a lot of what we do is try to have open debates in our professional society meetings to talk about this and to share experiences that we've had as mental health professionals. I think the worst scenario is when you say one way or the other, you have to do it, because as couples struggle, then they may feel that the mental health provider is so dogmatic that then they've cut off one source of support where they could try to hash these issues out, one way or another. And that one of the things, and this is a stance that is real middle of the road, that at least you should be there to be a confidential person that they can talk to about this stuff until they come to their own solution.
I mean, it seems to me the problem is part of, that you're referring to, Susan, is part of this larger problem that we've treated things that we call reproductive as part of this medical world, in the old days, at least the medical world knew something about adoption. But in the new days, it doesn't, because the people doing infertility treatment, the doctors doing that, are super specialized. They don't do adoptions. And then, in this country at least, there's this incredible separation of the traditional adoption world from all this world that we call reproduction. Now, the fact is, in this new reproduction world, we're doing the social equivalent of adoption, both what I would call step adoptions and full adoptions. But it doesn't matter. I mean, the analogies don't matter to the doctors if they don't know anything about traditional adoption. So, you know, they don't know, and to the degree I've seen in these advisory groups with various IVF clinics, they appear to know close to nothing about adoption, either about the no-selling sort of mentality that you're actually not supposed to get people to sell their genetic material. But they also don't know about this incredible change in the assumptions about secrecy in the adoption world. So that's really news to most people. So that I think there's, you know, what you have is this tradition of anonymity starting with donor insemination, and the doctors are just kind of rolling with it and operating in complete ignorance of the fact that there's now this kind of several decades of experience in adoption world where more or less everybody has agreed that secrecy is a bad thing. And I mean, I do think that's related to the larger issue. I mean, the premise, I think, of your comment, Susan, in the beginning was that, and it's one I disagree with to a degree, it's that there's something problematic about adoptive status. And that's part of why people want to keep a secret, is because actually it's problematic to tell a kid he isn't growing up with his biologic parents. Now, one of the things that's stunning here is that the doctors are regularly facilitating the creation of these new adoptees, when in the adoption world there's at least a lot of skepticism about whether it's the ideal thing for children to grow up with somebody other than their genetic parents. But
I think the question is whether they should know, not whether they should grow up with. In many
well,
cases.
that's one question. But I think another question is, I mean, for me certainly, is whether we should be persuading people through, for $10,000, $20,000 to be selling their, their gestational services, or $2,000 for your egg, or selling your IVF embryo, which is being done now in the IVF clinics. It's one of the ways of financing your IVF treatment. I didn't identify myself. I'm Elizabeth Bartholet, Harvard Law School.
I'm Joyce McGuire-Pavo, and there are a couple of things that I've been thinking, and I really appreciated each of the presentations. One is that we learned about donor insemination, I think it was over 200 years ago, from the bulls. And it was the cattlemen that started doing this and kept excellent records. And that was one of the most interesting things about it. The records were just absolutely perfectly kept. And they were kept that way because they wanted to know about medical and genetic information, to be able to pay attention to their stock. Now, it's very interesting to me that human beings have, a whole different category of attention being paid to these issues, and I think that's worth noting. The other thing is I have a problem with, a little bit with the way that you describe privacy and secrecy. So I think that there is a slight difference in, I think secrecy is definitely something that I do not believe is helpful, because it involves a secret about one of the people that it's including. Privacy, on the other hand, I think that if a family disclosed to their child or to intimate members, it is their own decision to make boundaries about who outside of that circle should know, and they have every right to that privacy. But I consider it secrecy not to tell the child about themselves. And I think that there is something about that we need to pay attention to, and that's something that I feel is real important. And the other thing is when, I agree with Susan that it's really important to educate people. And in your description, Sue, of the lesbian community being much more supportive because the community understood, one of the things we could take from that is something that Susan was suggesting, which is a much better job in educating the larger community about the importance of disclosure and information, and to create a holding environment that's more positive for all the people involved in all of these alternative families, including adoption.
And even, right, into the lay press about these are all these different kinds of ways to form families.
Absolutely.
Because this is what we have now. We have, you know, everywhere from 2 to 5 party reproduction now.
Yeah.
And it's going to probably take a generation or two until people are comfortable and have language again to describe all these different relationships. And I think we have to talk about it. We have to educate people.
There are
around
some
these
very
things.
good children's books.
Mommy, did I grow in your tummy?
Yeah, there's some very
I
excellent,
know.
in Great Britain, there are some
Yeah.
really wonderful materials available. So I think that those kinds of things could help people before they're, I mean, they're used mostly for talking to children, but I think the parents, as Steve said in his opening comments, that often it isn't so much the problem of the children, but the problem where the parents are in terms of how to take care of themselves in order to answer the questions.
Right, I mean, if you think about where you'd want to intervene, in my way of thinking, you have to intervene with the couple first, particularly with the man. You have to really talk with him about what this means to have a child that he is raising that goes against everything we know about sociobiology. Completely in the face of Darwin and all of that. And what does that mean for him? And what is he going to do with it? One of the things we have found also in terms of who has better self-esteem, fewer psychiatric symptoms, and better marital adjustment, there is a relationship between how long it takes you to decide to do donor and how well you do psychologically. The relationship is the longer you wait, the better off you tend to do. So the guys who come in, you know, Thursday they were in the doctor's office, found out their count was 0, and Friday are in your office saying we need to begin donor. From our data, we decided clinically to just put in a waiting period because we felt that it was important for the man and the couple to just deal with that information for a while. And that a real rapid medical solution, although very appealing, and of course parents will, or potential parents will feel very pressured to begin treatment, that might not be the best thing to do in a few months. Just to sit with it is often helpful.
So, you know, one of the, I'm Susan Dark from the Adoption Connection in Peabody, and we do the searches for adoptees.
This is the organization.
So I hope it opens up, because I don't want to be rifling through the sperm bank at any given point. And you know, we hear those kind of questions every day about what's going to happen for individuals who do and want to have a right to know. One of the things that I think you brought up was about the lesbian community who do tell their children. Well, they tell them because they have no alternative. The kids are going to know right away, we didn't come from these 2 women. So I happen to believe that it should start long before the male partner in the marriage, that it should start with the professionals. When you present something to somebody like the lesbians, they had no choice. It had to be open, they had to tell. And it just seems to me that that's what's happening now in adoption. For years, we didn't give adoptive parents that good feedback about this is okay to face this early on. And I happen to have been one of the kids who heard in the schoolyard at 7, because secrets don't stay secrets. They all eventually come out. If there was a way that we could guarantee positively that a secret would never be disclosed. But like Susan said, I didn't want to hear I didn't come from my mom and dad. I didn't want to hear I came from somebody else who loved me but couldn't keep me. But I did. And I did because my parents, like many, usually can't keep secrets either. And so the community, the school where I went to, the parish, everybody knew but me. And so in the 2nd grade, when it is thrown to you on the school ground in the midst of an argument, you're hearing it wrong. And my feeling about secrets is, whether it be from any type of means of infertility or to be fertilized, when you find out there's a secret, you automatically take on the responsibility that it was wrong, that it was something was wrong with you or the process. And so it seems fairly simple to me that, of course, the answer would be, of course you tell. And that if all this energy went into preparing the professionals and the couples versus do we tell, that this process would happen much sooner.
I think one risk here is that the adoption people are going to be appearing to be beating up the DI people.
Hearing, we are.
Because we supposedly know better. And in fact, those of us in adoption know very well that we don't always do the job very well, and we don't always maintain a good dialogue with our kids, for example, about their birth parents or their families of origin, or their previous lives. I don't mean in the supernatural sense. It's the previous families. And that this whole business of keeping up the dialogue and having this kind of seamless web in the child's experience of him or herself is something that we always have to work at very hard, and we have to continue to do that with adoption. But one thing that occurs to me in trying to make a distinction between secrecy and privacy, if secrecy is privacy with shame, who is to make the decision about whether there's shame or not? Certainly not the parent. Because if the parent deals with it by denying it, as Susan and you, for example, were talking about denial of fantasy in certain circumstances. If the parent chooses to deal with it by denying it, and instead says, well, I don't want to tell because my child will feel strange, well, that's plausible. The child may feel strange. But is that a reason not to do it, or is that a justification for not facing your own feelings? These are some of the dilemmas.
But I think, as George pointed out earlier, these whole technologies are not based on the best interest of the children, unfortunately.
Yeah.
They're based on meeting the needs of couples who feel desperate, desperate to have a genetic connection to their offspring. And it's a desperation like I've never experienced before in other clinical work. Not to explain it away, but that's the backdrop.
Some people on this side of the room that wanted to talk.
I just wanted to, my name is Tony Erdman, I'm with the Department of Psychiatry at Mass General, and I'm an adoptive parent. And I think one of the things that, that I think you're talking about a little bit when you say give the people time between their diagnosis and their technology is the development of the adoptive couple. And that this requires time and counseling and thought and discussion and all that kind of stuff, and that I think, at least judging from our development as a couple, it takes some time and movement over. I mean, no one assumes that they're going to be infertile, and I think that it just requires some time and some educating and some support from the point of view of the mental health professional going through that with them. And to me, it does seem quite analogous. I think there's a wish to deny the infertility, but I think it's quite analogous whether it's with adoption or with assisted reproduction. But that because it's a business, it's very seldom provided. I mean, it's not. I'm sure you don't see everything.
No.
You only see referrals, whereas in the adoption business, I mean, it doesn't matter who you are. You get ground through the system. Like everybody does, and I think it's worthwhile.
It's interesting, in our program, a social worker sees everybody who's coming in for either DI or in vitro. So for those subclasses of patients, yeah, that's a required mandatory visit. And then I tend to see the ones who have either more serious psychopathology or need longer-term work, or the screening interview is not enough.
But that's a screening interview as opposed to an ongoing relationship,
Exactly.
which is what you need for a development. And it doesn't take 2 months, it doesn't take 6 months, it takes
a couple of
it
years
takes
is
a couple of
ideal.
years, really, to achieve that development, in my experience. Before you're really comfortable
That's
with
what the
it.
data bear out. If you wait 24 months plus, you
Yeah.
tend to have the best
That
psychological
sounds right.
adjustment.
That sounds right.
It seems to
Is
me
that your
that,
waiting period?
No, that's, we just put in a few months. No, we couldn't get,
24 hours.
bear in mind, market influences are huge. Market influences are huge.
it seems that the couple is obviously in a crisis, dealing with some very stressful issues. And what's unfortunate is that none of the professionals in this situation are really looking out for the child. None of the laws are looking out for the child, and none of the professionals involved are thinking about the developmental issues or the ongoing constraints of this. And I think it would be extremely important to do more couples work, because the denial is between the couple, and the child holds that and is the one to act it out eventually. If the couple hasn't worked out some way of really acknowledging what the difficulty is and how they feel about it between themselves.
Can I just say that in gamete donation, I'm Norman Sherry, I'm a pediatrician. But in gamete donation, not telling, that is secrecy, shuts out all of the support systems that adoptive families have. I've been in practice for a long time, half time, and I have seen, probably on my practices filled with adopted kids, so that I have about 7 or 8% of my practice are adoptees. At the same time, I have had one couple tell me early on that both of their children were DI. They had done this for 2 summers. 2 summers they had gone to Switzerland, and she had been inseminated by the same doc did the procedure. I don't know whether the kids are sibs. They look alike. Both of these people are professionals, and it wasn't until the children were in adolescence and a lot of problems came up that I was able to get them in and say, do you think this has anything to do with... I got a beautiful letter from the father saying thanks for opening that door, and they're now, for the first time, able to tell their therapists.
And I'd like to pick up on that one, because that's the one that impacts. I'm Claudia Jarrett. I'm a child and family therapist, and I work with lots of different kinds of loss issues. And part of what concerns me is that we don't have an AAC for youngsters who are conceived in this manner. And I have probably at least twice a year, and I have a small practice, families where there's a divorce and it comes up because the parents are saying he really isn't your father anyway, and that's how the kid finds out at a double loss time, or a parent is dying and it comes up. And where are we going to put in support systems? I mean, in adoption, we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated about this is a lifelong implication, but we do not, I don't know where to, I mean, those families have been referred to me, and they've been referred to me because there's a potential loss. So they're being covered, but you think about, if I'm seeing the number I'm seeing in a very small practice, how much that's got to be happening, and who is going to be picking up to support families when it comes out at a double loss time. I think it's a significant clinical issue.
There's another ghost at the table, too. I'm Alan Crocker from Children's Hospital, and that is that as genetics has improved as a science in the last 15, 20 years, we've spread the propaganda that intelligent and preventive health care involves general knowledge of your genetic circumstances. And here we are in both situations, actually, in adoption and in certainly in the double other origin of the genetic material, we're facilitating a blank trip in which the capacity to behave intelligently about your own risk for hypertension or for allergy or for more exotic and more compelling genetic pressures is lost. And granted, it is not every human, but it's a substantial number of humans. We're talking here, if it's 40,000 known to be, or not known, but if you take the 20 and double it, that's 1% of births for that route by itself, which is getting to be palpable. A disorder that is 1% of the population is viewed as a relatively moderate or high incidence disorder. And so we've got a cluster of children going down life's road in the dark, and their parents often in the dark too, in terms of the system's failure to transmit that information. At least in conventional donor insemination, it's half. They're half dark. But the system is such that they can be indeed all dark, in the dark, if they wish. And so I wish in the discussion, not only is the psychic risk discussed, but the somatic risk is reckoned with as well.
And that's their greatest concern. The parents talk about this very openly. And this is where we get huge ceiling effects when we ask them, what's your biggest concern about this? It's not personality resemblance, it's not physical resemblance, it's the genetic and medical background. And that they're concerned about, what am I going to tell my child? What if the kid ends up in the pediatrician's office one day with a disorder that nobody can figure out what it is? What
Well, I
are they
was
gonna do?
involved in work with disorders like Tay-Sachs disease before the enzyme was accessible, so there was no prenatal diagnosis possible. So AI, as it was then, was the standard approach if you wish to build a family. And I was involved with a fair number of families, and it was usually house officers or medical students who were the donors. And both the donor and the family pledged me to keep everything secret. They both wanted it that way. I had a call about a month ago from one whose daughter is now 25 years old, has an unusual disorder, nothing related to Tay-Sachs, but an unusual disorder. And she said, tell me a little more about the donor, can you? They didn't want to know the donor's name, but did the donor stay healthy? You know?
But you know, there are less complicated situations where young women, birth mothers who we have come across, and Susan has come across, come to the Adoption Connection and say, look, I've got breast cancer. I'm 30 years old. The records are sealed. I have no intention of interfering with my child's life. What are we going to do? Well, the most sensible thing to do is to call the agency and say to them, look, Sally Smith has cancer. You've got to have a vehicle to inform the adoptive parents. Don't let her just, because this is a daughter, 13-year-old daughter, don't let her just go down the road like this. The agency refused to do it because the records are sealed. They would not act as intermediaries. Eventually, the birth mother, under her own steam, went to some physicians and went around to some other people and was able to identify the adoptive parents, and she wrote them a letter directly, which is what she did not want to do, but that's what she ended up doing. They were extraordinarily grateful. And she still said she did not want to interfere with a child's life. This is simple. I mean, early onset breast cancer is simple, and we all know the way it's inherited. And so we're still working in this sort of archaic record situation where people who are, I mean, how old are people when they're donors anyway? The medical students. I have an old friend in New York who was getting paid. He said one week you do blood, the next week you do semen, and they're each $40 a shot.
Right.
And now he's,
Quite
now he's 60
literally.
years old, and he says to me, sometimes I wonder where all those kids are.
You bet.
Oh, please.
But you know
I
what,
mean,
Sue, it seems like in some way, again, if we had disclosure, then maybe we're shortchanging the men too, because we've never given them specifically the option to say, look, do you mind just putting your name and address? I mean, you're not, even if they sign something that relieved them of any financial, emotional, physical responsibility, we shortchange birth parents for all these years saying they didn't want to be found, they didn't want to be known, we promised you secrecy. Well, I gave up my child 32 years ago, and what I wanted then and what I wanted 5, 10, 15, 20 years later is completely different. So maybe again we start to need to talk to people about, if you want to be a donor, this is the process.
The Canadians argue that in 18 years you'll probably change your mind again.
But then you don't
That's
have
why
the
they
right,
want it.
because again it goes back to
I
everybody
agree. I
making
don't think you should have
decisions,
to be able to
but
change
the
your mind. I
child,
agree. I
the
agree with
child.
that. But that's the
Never
argument the Canadians
Yeah.
actually use
You can
against
change your-
that universal thing that the
Yeah.
men themselves, when they're
Yeah.
20, would say yes, but when they're 38 would say no.
But it's a very little use to have the new law, 3 days old in your book there, that the medical information now has to be given, because again, that's medical information snapshot at one point in time.
That's
And
right.
unless there's some vehicle for ongoing and updating, it really isn't of the same use.
You know why my friend wanted to know where those kids were? Because he has cardiac disease now. And there was no history when he was 28 because his daddy was still alive. It has to be ongoing. And here we are, we haven't fixed this in adoption yet, and the thought of this, you know.
And this is, it's just a problem that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, and what would happen if you
It's
took
not
the
getting
money
smaller.
away? What if the
Well,
money
I was
went
gonna
away?
ask George, do you
How many
know-
donors would there be?
Right.
Do you know any, because I know in Sweden they stopped paying against sperm donors. Do you know if their supplies dried up?
It cut down, the first year it cut in half, and then it came back up. Although there are some people say in Sweden, a lot of people go outside of Sweden. I don't know if that's true or not. I think that's anecdotal.
Yeah.
One of the striking things here is a couple of related things that, I mean, we're all talking about how we should do various things. I mean, part of what's striking to me as a lawyer is that there's so little sense in this country that organized policy makers on various legislative fronts or even national commission fronts should do anything. I mean, one thing that's striking here to me is we massively regulate adoption. We have this presumption the child's interest should matter. We may not regulate it right, and I think all of us have a lot of criticisms, but there's at least a sense that it's a social policy issue, whereas in this other area, it's sort of social policy, hands-off, government doesn't touch it, private decision makers are making all the decisions along with the doctors. Now, if you look at what's going on in other countries, I mean, Canada is typical. We're aberrational. They've got this 2-volume report on the National Commission. Virtually every country, as I understand it, that is in our position technologically, that is fooling around with surrogacy and IVF embryo adoption, etc., has formed a national commission, has faced up to some of the multitude of ethical policy issues, and is at least struggling with them, and most of them have come out against the level of commercialization we have. They've limited at least some of the purchase and sale of genetic material. They're much more into openness. There are several countries with sort of absolute right of access to donor information. There are other countries that have outlawed sale of sperm, which in this country we think of as, I mean, my God, we couldn't do it. Well, it's probably true we couldn't outlaw sale of sperm in this country because we've let the doctors and the private decision makers create a status quo that's close to impossible to undo. Part of what scares me is that we are just going full steam ahead with all these other things. And my sense is 10, 15 years from now, we'll be where we're at now with donor insemination, which will be nobody can talk about making policy because it's been made by this hands-off attitude. I mean, so I think we should all get, commissions formed. And I mean, and again, I'm terribly nervous of how society is regulated in the adoption area, but I'm more nervous about not having anything happen here and just leaving it all in the hands of private parties, because they're not, I mean, adult private parties, I think, focus on adult private party interest, which here is making money and having parents do what they think they want. And I think at least the social policymakers are going to say that that child's best interest should count. And I think that counts for something, I mean, in terms of getting a slightly more rational system.
So I'm Ray Levy. How interested are, this is a fair question, the physicians in the question of educating, making the referrals, educating the couples, what's good for the child? Is that, can I ask you
Ray, can I tell you, I was asked to, I'm on the ethics committee for one of these, at one of the hospitals for DI and gamete donation. And they said, gee, you talk to children so well, would you come up with an article on how to tell children about gamete donation? Well, I didn't have time at the time, and my daughter, who's a social worker at the Children's, said, I'll work on it with you, I'll do the paperwork. So we put it together and presented them with a plan. And they said, wait a minute, there's nothing in that for not telling. And I said, well, and Molly said, we believe that you should tell for many reasons, much later than an adoption. And the reasons are all outlined. But they said, well, no, you have to put in a couple of paragraphs about what, because there are a lot of people out there who are not telling, and the other docs are going to be very upset by this.
I don't mean to be flip when I say they're not interested in it. there are a lot of nice doctors doing this work for altruistic reasons. I have to backpedal here pretty quickly. I don't think it's not in their realm of what they're thinking of when they're doing this. They're thinking of fertilization rates, they're thinking of how many amps of pergonal, not how is that kid going to feel at 5? How is that child going to feel
Well,
at
most
14?
obstetricians aren't interested in babies.
Right.
No, they are.
Getting the woman to the point of
Pediatric people are.
Right.
No.
I mean, it's
And even more importantly in continuum is how is that child going to feel at 25 and 35 and 50 when she becomes a grandmother? And now not only you are affected by your lack of information, but another generation is going on without it as well. And
I'm a child clinician. I'm Jerry Ferber. I'm a child clinician, and for the past 4 years, in addition to being a child clinician, I have worked in an infertility program. So I do all the, we do have a policy that everybody who's doing donor insemination needs to have that same one initial meeting with me, and to disclose or not to disclose is one of the topics, obviously. Coming into it with my knowledge of children and families and the same knowledge that you all have, that there really is no such thing as a family secret, I early on took a very advocacy position that I really thought it was best. I have to say I backed away from that a little bit as I've listened to the couples. I know what my own value is, but I feel like I'm a little more constrained now in putting my values on other people. I do have all of the books on the coffee table of how was I conceived, and and I think that makes a statement. But in listening to couples, and I think that they struggle long and hard, and they're very confused, and the fact is we don't have any research. I think your research is really about the most compelling that we have. I don't think that we really know what's right for every couple, and my feeling as a child and family clinician is if the parents are comfortable with something, it's going to work better than if the parents are not. And I make the analogy in my mind about do I tell a new mother to breastfeed or to bottle feed? Well, I don't. I try to think with her about what's going to be best for her. Do I advocate sleeping alone or co-sleeping? I think with the families about it. And somehow I feel like we need to do that with this because couples who have gone through infertility are so shattered by this experience, and their self-confidence, and there's a lot of magical thinking that goes on that maybe they really shouldn't be parents, and maybe this is God's message, and a lot of feelings of inadequacy. And I worry a lot about my role as the expert who knows all about this, giving them the message that if they don't tell, they're somehow harming their child. And I just feel like it is so complex and so confusing, and that we have to really be careful about what the message that these soon-to-be, hopefully, parents are going to be leaving our offices with, and are we setting them up for yet another struggle, and are we setting them up for yet more conflict? So what I do is I just try to educate people. This is my new and current position, and I may change my mind after I leave here today, because I feel like I'm always changing my mind and always.
But you're seeing them once.
Yeah.
You're seeing them one time?
Yes, this is true. So my feeling about that is I need to just educate them and tell them what I know, what I've learned from other parents, what I've learned from the research, talk with them about the pros and cons. But I now try not to make a statement. I used to say as a child clinician, and I do, I still say as a child clinician, I really don't believe that there's such a thing as a family secret, because I don't believe that.
But that's asking a lot of you to
Yeah.
deliver in one session.
In one
when
session.
the adoptive parents went through the same struggles. They decided to adopt rather than to do DI. Adoptive parents suffer tremendously from infertility, and the one thing we've been able to do is whatever one might think of the social agencies, there are people there to talk to for a long, long time.
And people
just
could
find-
come back. I mean,
that was one of the things I wanted to know.
Most people don't want to hear what I have to say anyway.
Well, it's
You're
very much.
identified
One of the
with
things that's
the
really
know that?
interesting, yeah, with what we do is couples now, they keep track of what I'm going to call each year. Oh, yeah, Sue, well, we're thinking this, and now we're talking about that, and we talk about your attitudes about this change. We had one couple, though, who's in a real bind. They got pregnant on the first cycle of DI. He has a low count, and they got pregnant naturally very shortly after they delivered their first child. Now their dilemma is, are they going to tell? And it gets very, very complicated by having this other child in the picture. And initially, they told no one in terms of other family and friends. And now they're saying, we're really glad we didn't tell anybody, because now we're not going to disclose because we're afraid what that's going to do to the two children, having one a DI child and one not a DI child. And what does that mean in the mix?
What's the difference between
a biological and a
I know, but it's their experience of it. That would I try to listen to? I have to meet them where they are, or I'm not doing my job as a clinician.
Sue, you know, one of the things that I heard was Sue and Jerry.
I've seen them for 5 years at this point, and we do the best we can. I think it's far more detrimental for me to say you have to do this, and them feeling like they couldn't come back to me to have a dialogue.
Right.
They have to understand why they need to do it. That's the hard part.
And with
That's
Jerry, I
true.
can understand not wanting to take a position, because in all honesty, as much as I favor disclosure, but it still seems like maybe you don't want them to hurt at that moment. I'm more worried about that family hurting 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the road. And I mean the parents too. I think secrets are the worst thing in the world, and it is going to affect that relationship with that child. So it may be a quick fix not to make them face this issue in the beginning, but is it really doing them any good? Not to say you have to,
But we don't
but
know
think
yet
about
with DI
this.
children.
There's another point too, and I think it's where I started my change of position. And not that I feel like I'm having a firm position, but it really started when I started to meet with culturally diverse people. And I'm thinking, I don't know anything about this culture, about the Arab culture or the, whatever culture. So how can I presume, I don't know anything about the value of fertility or fraternity or anything like that. And I just felt like it was presumptuous to take what I know about our culture and try to assume that. Because if the family and the community is not going to be able to accept this child, that's a setup.
Disclosure that's not an empathic disclosure is probably worse than no disclosure at all. And I think that if parents disclose something to a child because they feel external pressure to do that, just as many adopting couples back 20, 30 years ago, it was the agency said, well, do you promise to tell? I said, well, yes, of course. And then, of course, they're like honest people. They say they felt they were isolated. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't know when to do it. Some of them did it successfully. Some of them did it not so successfully. But those of us in adoption, we all have our horror stories of a child who wasn't told until at some point around age 11 or 12 or 13, and there was friction between the parents, and the TV was set was on, something about adoption, and the kid turns to his mother and says, oh, by the way, was I adopted? He said, yeah. That's it. We all know these horror stories. And I think in the case of DI, if somebody's told, but there's not the opportunity to work with these people, and there isn't the societal kind of institution or expectation that there's going to be some opportunity to talk this out over a period of time, then there you are.
There are DI kids. Actually, what's that group, Susan? We get that newsletter.
Yeah, there is one
There's a
that
whole
deals
group of them.
specifically
But
with.
most of them don't know who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
And
but
then-
You can't study them, you can't see how, I mean, it's a
Well,
very.
many of us have seen them in therapy as adults, because they did find out along
Right.
the way in a certain way, and they ended up, seeking out someone who had some understanding about this, so they end up with someone who has some adoption background. But I think that the issues are very similar, and similar also to a family where, a parent died very early on, the parent remarried, never told the child that wasn't their birth parent. I mean, the issues, their stories are different, but the feelings of the children about the trust that is lost in not being told the truth, and about the issues of, having this new information to integrate at certain points.
I think intuitively and clinically what you're saying does make a lot of sense to me. We haven't ever followed these children though to see actually how they develop.
But I'm
And I
saying
know
we've
there's
seen plenty of the adults and how the adoption
Maybe you
information
could
begins to
intertwine and
become
start
more
to use
available.
them.
I've had a number of couples who, one of whom have been adopted. And it's been very interesting to hear them think through the whole donor examination and disclosure thing. And I have found that they're mixed. It's not like everyone who I have seen who has been himself or herself adopted is for disclosing.
And what about a wife who wants to disclose and a husband who doesn't? Or the father who says, I believe the kid should know this, and the mother says, don't you dare. And that happened years ago for adoption as well.
I think we're dealing with a cultural thing, aren't we? I mean, our culture has this set, and that's what we've been working on, this sort of set of what is a family. You know, it is this particular model made up this particular way. And what we're struggling with is how we change that model so that different things are more acceptable, so that there's room for openness.
And it was like that, you know, years ago for adoption. When adoption first, parents were advised not to tell because the child would feel different. The child would be put in a different category. And so we're doing the same thing, when in fact we're not giving children enough credit or parents enough credit. Because I believe with education, parents will do a wonderful job. They'll be afraid, they'll be scared, but every parent or every person who is a parent is for another reason. But again, if a parent handles something, then a child will handle it. And like sex education, you won't sit them down at 3 and give them the whole DI story, but it will progress throughout the years.
I think there's a danger of oversimplification. I've been involved in working in adoption for a long, long time, and I've seen how the trend has changed over a long time, but part of what I think is an operative phrase that keeps getting used is years ago. We're talking about something that in this field is not years ago, it's now. And it's going to take people some time to gather the kinds of information and empirical data and anecdotal material to be able to move with that. I think one of the major things that made for a primary shift in terms of telling in the adoption field was put upon people by the change of there not being infant adoption. And I think where we began to, our years ago, look at telling kids and having to tell kids was about 1978, 77, when we started doing transracial adoption much more. We started doing older kid adoption. Then there was no question about telling, in the same way with lesbian couples. There's no question about telling. But I think to expect that this field is going to see itself as identical to the journey we've been on when it is not an identical journey, and that things will turn around rapidly because of what we've learned in our journey is not necessarily fair. I think it's important not to impose some sort of this is how it is in the best interest. I think we are in agreement about there are pieces of, none of us necessarily are comfortable with how secrets are going to be kept in families, how should things be disclosed. But I don't think it is fair to expect the beginning parts of some, I mean, the information that Sue shared was fascinating to me today. I didn't know anything about the study you were doing. I got some very good pieces of information, raised some questions for me. I want to think about it. But I don't think it's identical to adoption. I think that some of the things are going to transfer over, but I don't think we yet know what transfers over necessarily. And I don't mean to be in any way arguing for secrecy. As I say, one of the issues I deal with on a present and active basis more than once a year in my practice is some child who gets this piece of information when there is already a major whammy going on in the family. I'm very concerned about it, but I don't think we necessarily have a body of empirical data for parents to say, here are some of the pros, here are some of the cons, here are some of the things to say, this is when to tell. And my concern, again, is the one I raised. Where is the ongoing process? I'm fascinated to hear that people could come back and talk with you. I'm fascinated to hear that people could come back and talk with you. I think dialogues where we're not trying to convince one another that the models match, but rather that there are a lot of similarities and how can we support families supporting their children is a really useful thing for us to be doing today. But I don't think it's necessarily a match. And I know Joyce is sitting over there, having been involved in this for a long time too. It took a while for that Queen Elizabeth II to turn itself around.
I think that's why the real, there's so much importance to the boundary of confidentiality for us as health professionals that we have with our patients, because that gives them a really good place to come back to if they feel it's safe to come back and process this information. That family knew that they could come and talk to you and that it was a safe contained place with a boundary. And I think that's a very important point to make. I think that's getting to your point. That's
And
an
that you're
ongoing
telling these
process.
families there is this ongoing process, and we would, you know, I don't know what the funding mechanism for all of that is, but I think what you're doing is really exciting, and I think we will
It's my
all
phone
learn.
bill.
Yeah. A lot of us understand that one.
In the initial encounter, if we could present it, that there are other opportunities for disclosure later as well as now, and that we present the pros and cons, but we also recognize where they're at. And if we can inform them that they can change their mind later, and may change their mind later as the pressures of the child who will bring it about, or as the family develops and grows, or new things happen, and somebody starts looking for blue-eyed children and blue-eyed parents, and maybe parents then can do something which they couldn't do before. I agree with Steve that I think pushing disclosure when people aren't ready isn't.
I don't think that we should be pushing
Pushing
disclosure.
that.
I think it's absolutely important to be educating people about why it might be a good thing.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
What I'm worried about is the professionals colluding with society at
With the
large.
secrecy.
In the secrecy and in agreeing that this is better left untouched. What I think is important, this is the one moment in time perhaps, especially with these families that can go and keep it a secret, to give them the opportunity to have the education, and as you say, to let them know what might happen along the path developmentally. And I mean, that I think we have learned, and it's not that I think they're exactly the same, but we certainly have learned some things that we can impart to families and give them the